There'll be no more traffic on this repeater unless authorized by the trustee.
Stick around and we'll get right to it. Hey, welcome back, guys. I'm here with Mark today. This is really cool because Mark spent 16 days running the Tactical Operations Center for Grindstone Ministries. And in case you don't know, Grindstone Ministries was heavily involved in the recovery effort in East Tennessee. Mark, I appreciate you taking some time with me today.
Thank you.
So I just want to know, what was that experience like? Did you have it? So first of all, let me back up. Was this your first deployment with Grindstone?
No. So my first deployment with Grindstone was at Rolling Fork, Mississippi. This was it was still in 2023, I believe.
Okay.
So this was my second deployment with Grindstone, but I've been spending a lot of time with these guys and built up a lot of trust. And so my boss, who's a board member of Grindstone, called me up and said, "Hey, I need you to get in the truck and go. They need somebody to act as like an operations officer, 2IC sort of deal." So within a couple hours, I threw what I thought I needed in the truck, and you saw that same camper, and made the drive. And
yeah, because you really never know what you're walking into. So
Right.
How do you prepare for that? Take everything?
You try not to take everything. I'm a notorious overpacker, so I will usually pack the gills whatever I have, whether it's bags or vehicles, and I tried specifically not to do that this time. I tried to rein myself back in and say, okay, well, what are the high points that I'm going to be dealing with? So if I'm going to be running a talk, I know I'm going to have intel requirements. I know I'm going to have communications requirements at a minimum. So if I focus on those two things, which are well in my wheelhouse, then I should be good. So I brought what little comm stuff I had at the time, and as well as some intel stuff, and that was it. It's mostly, it's mostly radios and computers and stuff like that.
Right. So when you walked in, now you guys were stationed at the Cherry Grove Baptist Church, right?
We were, yeah.
Okay, so when you walked in that first day, well, first of all, the storm hit, I believe it was on a Friday night, is that right?
I think it was the 27th, so I want to say it was a Friday night.
Okay, and when did you roll in? You were there within a couple of days, correct?
Right. I want to say I came in either Sunday night or Monday night, the 1st.
Okay.
I was there on the 1st.
So what was it like when you first walked in right after this storm had hit?
So on the drive in, it was noticeable that there were power issues. For sure. It was dark, so I didn't see a lot, but what I didn't see was noticeable, right? Because when you're driving through neighborhoods and things like that, you see street lights, you see porch lights and things like that. A lot of stuff was absent. So when the only light in front of you in the truck is your headlights, you're either way out in the sticks or there's power issues.
Right.
So that was the first thing that really struck me as odd. But you know what you're driving into, so you expect it, right? So then when we got into the Baptist Church, Cherry Grove Baptist Church, they put us in the youth ministry building,
okay,
which bonus is an all steel building. So from a communications perspective, now we're scratching our heads like, okay, well, antennas are a thing, and metal buildings are usually not great for that.
Welcome to the Faraday cage.
So what do we do, right? So quickly, and it was bare bones. So we're grabbing every table that we can find. I brought some lighting with me, some like the Harbor Freight string lights, power strips, and you're just trying to establish a corner near some sort of an egress point, whether it's a window or a door, because I know I need to run antenna lines. Again, metal building, right? So that's what we do. I pick a corner, any corner, near the back door. We get power set up, we start to break out radios, and the first thing we want to do is comm checks. Comm checks were a little bit more difficult because of geography and topography, and that'll be a theme for, I'm sure, the rest of this talk, is the constraints, the left-right limitations of your geography really dictate your operating modes and your frequencies, and that was hit over our heads every single day. All day, every day.
So were you relying on VHF and UHF, or were you guys trying to establish HF comms?
So backing up, the first thing I needed to get up was VHF. So I'm a technician, not a general. I brought an HF receive capability, but I needed to get up on something, right? And so we used, it's called a Hamocan, VHF radio, get up on some kind of comms. We have a bunch of Yaesu, HTs, and Baofeng, so at least we could intercommunicate, and we could start listening in on what's happening on the repeater. From there, now I needed to shift gears, right? So I've got some kind of comms capability up that I can listen to while I'm working on Intel stuff now, because now we got to start doing target development. What are the things that we have? What are the things that we don't have? So starting with critical infrastructure. The river, the Nowachucky River, that thing must have risen 20 plus feet. It was a monster. They say it moved more water than the Mississippi. It was wider, it grew wider than the Mississippi and moved more water than Niagara Falls.
Wow.
And once daylight hit, you saw what that really meant. So just you and I speaking, we can talk about that. And it's like, oh yeah, okay, that means the river was really big. The river ate everything. So it ate 50% of the bridges that were in that Jonesboro area. That mobility was crushed. And then a highlight for us was the community of Little Germany, where their only road in and out was completely scraped from the earth. Just did not exist anymore.
Gone.
Gone, completely gone. The same with the bridges. The bridges weren't damaged per se. It wasn't like, oh, there's a broken bridge. The bridge is no longer there. There's two sections of earth on each side where there's supposed to be a bridge, and there's just nothingness in between.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Now, you said something. You said you're developing targets. Exactly what do you mean by that?
Yeah,
Look,
yeah, probably poor word usage. We're developing areas that we need to focus on for aid, right? So who needs stuff and who needs work? And so the work we break out into two different line items. It's either chainsaw crews or heavy equipment. That's where Grindstone Ministries really excels. Is we can find these homesteads or these properties that have been wrecked. They work through the FEMA insurance process to say, okay, this is basically what they're going to be able to recoup, and then traditionally in the tornado damage, Grindstone would basically like scrape the pad for them, all free of charge, get all the debris removed. So any of the insurance money that went to the resident could go towards rebuilding or just rehoming themselves.
so they didn't have to pay for that cleanup.
Exactly.
Right. You guys are taking care of that.
Yes. Yeah.
So that's the kind of work you're looking for when you get on the ground.
Correct.
That's the intelligence you're trying to gather, right?
Exactly.
Okay, so where does this, I mean, you have no cell phone, you have, or at least the people that need the help have no cell phone, they have no internet. How do you find out about these people?
You have to go to them, right? Their mobility is completely destroyed. If they had vehicles, they're no longer functioning. There was no cellular service. In fact, today, cellular service is spotty at best. So that means you have to go out and pound the pavement, and that's what you do. So you figure out, okay, well, where's my local law enforcement, because they're going to be doing something. So that's a dot on the map, and then we can start asking law enforcement, okay, well, what are your focus areas right now? Who can we help? We must have asked that question 10,000 times. Who can we help? Who do you know that we can help right now?
So you're trying to plug into the local community, the public services that are still online.
Correct. So we're interfacing with the EOC. In this case, it was Tennessee. They're TEMA.
Right.
TEMA is also affiliated with FEMA, and so they'll have a couple of representatives there too. So we're plugged into there with what's called it's a volunteer management acronym that I'm spacing on right now, but they basically the emergency management office for that county or that state will bucket all the volunteer organizations, say, okay, well, here's how we're going to utilize these resources, and then they have other resources that they can tap into. Grindstone Ministries, we really don't wait for the work. We're going to go and we're going to find our own work. And so that's exactly what we do. We plug into the local community as fast as humanly possible. And then from there, we're asking, okay, well, you need this help. We got it covered. Who else needs help, right? And so the one person that we help, we might get, 2 to 3 more leads, and it just snowball effects, right? And the more work we do, the more we're visible in the local community.
The more you're out there.
Yeah, and that starts building up work too. So,
all right. So let's kind of jump over to the communication side of it. How does the communications play a role in these jobs that you're doing? I expect it to be a pretty significant role with radios since there is no other infrastructure around.
Right. So this was truly zero communications infrastructure walking into it. With tornadoes, usually there's cellular service. If cellular towers are affected, usually it's pretty isolated, and they'll bring in a cell on wheels to kind of fill that gap. This is not that. The damage was so widespread that you're not getting any cellular coverage, right? And you see really quickly how we all depend on cellular infrastructure when it goes away. So that means, all right, what comms do we have? What can we leverage? I brought a Starlink with me. Grindstone Ministries has a few Starlinks as well. So that gets us internet access there at our forward operating base, the FOB. You'll hear me call it the FOB or the TOC kind of interchangeably, so that gets us internet access to the outside world. So, and we cover that we had the handy talkies for interoperability. What we found with that geography and the topography is VHF and UHF comms are good for talking across the parking lot, but as soon as you leave, it doesn't do you any good because you've got hills and mountains in the way.
Right.
So that meant getting to the repeaters, and we concentrated a lot of communications on the 2-meter repeater K4LNS. That repeater was also the primary means of communication. It was the only means of communication for Little Germany as well, which we can talk about at length. That was near and dear to our hearts, that cutoff community. So in any case, we're up on 2 meters. Eventually, we had to come up on GMRS and GMRS repeaters as well. And then very early, we reached out to Amron. And we said, because we had just done an exercise with them through Refuge Medical. Mm-hmm. So we did this kind of culmination exercise, or an FTX, a final training exercise, where we took a bunch of folks out on a nighttime operation, introduced medical problems, and Amron was facilitating some of the HF back end, where we're doing like scenario messaging and stuff like that, so we could really show the capability of HF, specifically digital modes, to our leadership. Our leadership at the time was very VHF, UHF focused. It's what they've used, it's what they know, right?
Well, and in a tornado, if you need radios, that's probably sufficient.
Yeah, and
because it's a small area that takes the worst of the impact.
Yeah, exactly. It's total devastation where it touches,
right.
But all things considered, it's pretty narrow.
Right.
So HF digital modes, I thought were going to be important. We ended up being very right about that. And I reached out to Amron and said, hey, we know this is in your wheelhouse now. We've worked together. What can we do to get some deployers out here? And overnight, they came up with their own personnel management strategy for deployers, started making contact with everybody that they knew, got a schedule, and started shipping dudes out. And so now we're getting, because we also put a call out for ham radio operators, which is not necessarily the same thing. Right? So people that focus on emergency communications, it's way different than,
talking on the repeater.
Chewing the fat on the 2-meter repeater, right? So happy to have everybody, but my plan from the beginning was, okay, let's get Amron operators on board, because I know they're going to be up across the modes. We're already up on 2 meter, and we have an ability to get up on GMRS, but that HF, I think, is going to be clutch. So that's what they did. They came in, immediately evaluated what we had was insufficient, I will say, and which is fine. I'll take the hit. And all the deployers come in with their own kit, which is truly something special, right? Because they've got skin in the game. They're on their own time, on their own dime with their own kit. They're exposing to a literal disaster area. So
Right.
I think that's something pretty special. But they also know how to operate. So now we're getting AMRON operators coming in. We're getting ham radio operators, dudes showing up, kind of cold calling, knocking on the door like, hey, I'm a ham radio operator. We have a vetting process with Grindstone that's very critical because we've got to be able to, we got to know who's coming, right, for obvious reasons.
Right.
So when the ham radio operators come in, my first order of business is, okay, here's AMRON guys. Here's what AMRON is, and here's where you're going to start plugging in, and we start training up kind of the next AMRON operators. That was the goal. You'll have to ask them, you'll have to ask JJS how successful that's been so far and how that translates to new, AMRON membership. But I think it was hugely successful. But
Well, I'm curious of something here, and I don't mean to interrupt, but I do want to figure this out real quick. You've got internet at your headquarters.
we do.
Why do you need radio operators if you've got internet?
Because we've got SAW and heavy equipment teams.
And they're going out.
They're going out with no cellular. The way I phrased it was, it's a cellular denied environment, right? And we don't just have Starlinks falling out of our pockets. And so that's where radio is incredibly important. So if a guy parks, a steel chainsaw into his thigh, we need to be able to quickly at least get notification, if not flex some sort of medical resources to them.
Okay.
Which we had. We had access to one civilian helicopter, and then through the EOC, we had access to 60s. So the idea was, okay, we've got a medical emergency, we need to do CASEVAC, then we know where they are, we know how to get the bird there, we know how to interoperate, go forth and do great things, right?
Okay.
So that's why it was so critically important. That's also why later on, when we had issues with the repeater, that it became a mild crisis for us in the talk, because now we're having to change our communication strategy on the fly with teams that are already deployed. How do you do that?
So you got guys in the field.
Correct.
And now you run into a problem with the repeater.
Correct.
So basically they're cut off.
They're not cut off. We had a strategy for it, and again, that's where AMRON really shined. Because we essentially switched over onto another 2 meter repeater, and then split comms from a very overworked Mount Mitchell repeater, which you've already you did a video about.
Right.
Those folks are gangsters. And then the GMRS repeater that we found was equidistant to where the talk was and where we were operating with our remote teams.
Okay.
And made it work. And then later they came up on HF as well, just as a backup strategy, because voice presents a lot of issues within emergency communications, right? Because everybody either needs to or wants to talk all at the same time right now, because it's all important.
Right.
Right. And that's where your net controllers, that's where your Dans and your Vickies were absolute gangsters on the Mount Mitchell repeater, because they were trained. They had done enough reps and sets where they knew how to manage that traffic.
Right.
Where not every repeater is going to be that way. But if we can get over on digital modes, now we're really kind of cutting through the noise.
Well, and you can run multiple streams.
You can.
In a very small environment, HF band wise.
Absolutely.
So that's nice to be able to, send 2 or 3 pieces of traffic all at the same time back to your headquarters.
Right.
So that's another huge advantage of HF digital communications.
Right. Now the VHF side with the SAW crews and the equipment crews got really interesting too, because they might be in one place for a while where your radio operator could get out of the truck. You know, maybe he's got something portable, or he's just on an HT and he's still able to communicate. Everything's gravy, right? Well, or the situation could also be where, all right, well, we're just gonna be in the truck the majority of the time, kind of trying to penetrate into these hard to reach areas where you might be in and out of the truck for 5 or 10 minutes at a time. They're like, there's no set schedule.
Right.
So the AMRON operators had to be very flexible with that. You know, if you're going to exit the truck, basically they needed to have a comm strategy for their mobility. So in the vehicle and out of the vehicle, and it had to be tight because they didn't know how long they're going to be in and out of the vehicle or what that even looked like. So it was a very dynamic environment just for communications. It was a dynamic environment for all other areas, but even just in communications, I think the lessons learned here are absolute gold. Because unless you're in that situation, the things you may not just even think about.
Right.
Geez, I've got so much on the brain. I don't know where else you want to go next.
Well, I wanted to talk, because you've told me a little bit about Little Germany.
Little Germany.
And Baofengs take a bad rap a lot of times. I'm guilty of it from time to time. But Baofengs are widespread. They're everywhere.
They are.
So
this is
you
where
have a success story of a Baofeng.
And I have been preaching this success story because there's no other way to put it. Like Gordon with his 5-watt Baofeng saved the lives of his community. Period.
Wow. And this is in Little Germany.
This is in Little Germany.
Physically located.
He is a resident in Little Germany.
Okay.
Right. So they're watching this river rise, and eventually it crests the street, and they know, like, okay, this is a problem, but it's also the storm kind of happened, into the evening, right? So there's a lot that they can't see. They wake up the next morning and there's feet of silt and mud, and now their mobility internally is crushed because there's just mud. You can't get through it. And the road, the egress in and out, is now gone. It's 100% gone.
That's the road you were talking about earlier.
Correct.
You said it disappeared.
Right.
Okay.
It literally disappeared overnight. And so speaking with, I had lunch with Terry and Gordon today, and I wanted to make sure I got their absolute notes. That's why I keep looking over here.
Okay.
But they wake up the next morning, Gordon sees feet of mud. No one's driving or walking anywhere. And the first thing he does is he gets on a skid steer and he starts trying to cut away some of this mud. And once he's getting buckets full of mud, and he's trying to clear a place to kind of see what's beyond his little hill. And once he gets to the hill, he realizes, oh, we're trapped here. There's no way in or out. They don't know what the damage looks like on the outside. They don't know if anybody knows. They don't know if the outside is aware of their status on the inside. From a communications perspective, they are black. They have nothing coming in and nothing going out. So his instinct is, okay, I need to get on the radio. And Gordon had already fleshed out a plan for kind of community preparedness, where he gave out some bubble pack radios, like some FRS radios. They'll communicate with him. He's a licensed radio operator, and then he can be the filter in and out.
Right.
Except Gordon hadn't pushed the push-to-talk yet. He had been lurking on the 2-meter repeater.
He's a licensed operator.
But
he hadn't talked
right
on the repeater up to this point.
Right.
Okay.
And so now he pushes the button and basically tells the world, hey, this is my call sign. This is where we are. We're alive back here. And that's what gets the ball rolling. And his counterpart on the outside, Terry, answered the call and spent the next, 12 to 14 days from sun up to sundown parked his truck and his mobile kit at the Washington County Sheriff's kind of pop-up command center at one of the bridges that was washed out. Every day, all day, every day. He was Gordon's lifeline in and out, that 5-watt Baofeng.
Wow.
And fortunately, that Baofeng was configured for the 2-meter repeater, because I don't know if anybody would have heard him otherwise.
Yeah.
Think about that brand new radio, right? If it's not programmed and now you're cut off from the world, how do you get the information to program it to talk to somebody?
And this is exactly why when somebody tells me, yeah, I bought a radio and I threw it into my bag and I'll use it if I ever need it.
It's worthless.
It's like, man, you gotta know, you gotta practice. It's worth getting your license just to be able to practice even hitting a 2-meter repeater before something like this happens.
Absolutely.
So,
Fortunately, he had done that. He was on the repeater, right? Repeaters have tones. They have the deviation for the transmit and receive.
right.
If you just took your brand new radio and threw it into a backpack, you're not going to have any of that.
Yeah.
On top of which, now you have no internet connectivity, so you're not going to even get the information to program your radio correctly.
You can't go to YouTube.
No, you can't. They couldn't. So even things like the FM radio stations were unique in that they could hear some stuff from the FM radio, but the FM radio is really broadcasting like they do every other day. So if your radio station is in, if it's 50 miles away, like they're not impacted really by the storm. So they're just business as usual. And that became a source of frustration too, because now they're information starved. But I'll back up. So now you've got Gordon on the inside, and you've got Terry on the outside, and they are literally each other's lifelines at this point, which I think is an amazing story. The EOC coordinated a helicopter, a UH-60 Blackhawk, to take out the women and children. So the women and children evacuated, I want to say that Sunday after the storm, and now their population has just reduced by 50+%. It's all dudes in there, and they're still trying to cover down on their homesteads and their properties. Everybody was worried about looting. The sheriff's department dropped 2 deputies in there to just presence and patrol for looting, and not really germane to the communications piece, but they did have some kind of trunked radios, but even those were spotty at best, just because of how little Germany is tucked into this cove. From a physical security perspective, it's great. From a communications perspective during an emergency, it's awful. and that's what they learned. They learned through hardship,
Right.
what those limitations were. But God bless them for getting on the radio and just saying, "Hey, we're here, we're alive."
Hey, that $17, $18 Baofeng definitely came in clutch.
Right. Yeah. So I think the community is 86 people, right?
Oh, that's small.
So what's the dollar value?
Right.
For immediate evacuation of 43 people and keeping another 43 people resupplied enough to stay alive until another road can be built.
By chance, did he mention how he kept that Baofeng charged?
He did. So he had a solar setup.
Okay.
Very portable solar, like the stuff you get from Jackery or My Patriot Supply, stuff like that. So got his portable solar set up and was charging batteries during the day. He had a generator. He had to take parts from an older generator to fix another generator and like retrofit it to get it to work. And then he was up on generator power too, and using that to charge batteries.
Okay.
To keep them in fresh batteries.
All right. Yeah, I was just curious because if you're cut off and you don't have that power, I was curious how he managed to.
And his truck as well. So he could run his truck for a while and charge batteries that way. But I mean, now fuel is a thing.
Right. Right.
for the generator as well.
Yeah.
So this is where Grindstone Ministries stepped in to help with that resupply effort. And then we also deployed an Amron member in there. So we hiked with a local guy. His name's Kelvin. Terrific guy. I'll say it to the entire internet. Kelvin is a superhero. He's going to hate that I said that. He really is. He hiked in. He owns, of course, I don't have it in my notes right now. He owns a climbing supply shop. And so he went out there. I call him the Little Germany Billy Goat. He went out there and Billy Goated this trail and started trying to put in safety lines so people could at least attempt to traverse in and out. That trail was truly akin to a goat trail. At the far ends, it's very much like a sidewalk. Half the road is missing, but it's as wide as a sidewalk, and it's not that bad. Until you get to that middle section, and it gets real sporty. And every day, that trail got just a little bit worse because it's getting foot traffic. It's getting, people are sliding. It's muddy.
So Grindstone's physically man-packing everything in.
Yes.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. And so that was something I did as well. Just kind of leading that charge, hey, they need stuff. They have no way to get stuff in other than a 60, and we were having issues with the 60s in the resupply. So a decision was made pretty quick, we're going to solve this problem. Pack muling everything from fresh scoop cat litter to 40-pound propane tanks, gasoline on parts of a trail that are no wider than your boot.
Wow.
Very, very high risk, especially from an organizational perspective, right? Because we're all volunteers. And so we can't really ask a volunteer to do something that's that dangerous without assuming some sort of liability and all that good stuff. So just, mental gymnastics that are going through my head, and just made the decision hey, we're going to go do this. And so that's what we did. We did a little bit each day. They were getting supplies in. I think they got a few drops from the 60 in from the EOC. And so this kind of ties into the coordination piece, right? So the EOC is managing and monitoring their needs, and then we're doing the same thing. We're working in two different parallel efforts and not really communicating. But it's all for the good of that community. And I just lost my train of thought. Parallel efforts, but we're working nonetheless. We want to get them what they need when they need it. So timeliness of receipt, I thought, was very important. And
So how long was Little Germany cut off like this before they? Because I know they rebuilt the road.
They did.
I don't know
This was
how
just
long.
in the past couple of days.
Okay, so basically they've been cut off for a month, 5 weeks.
They were cut off for a minimum of 16 days. I would say probably closer to 18 to 20 days.
Okay.
Right. The only ways in and out were helos, which would have been just out for them, and the trail, if you were willing to hike it, and then the forestry service cut in this logging road, which is super sporty, not super safe, but for ATVs to come in and out. And that's how the sheriff's department kept going back and forth.
I'm not going to drive the Honda Civic over it.
You're not. No. You're not going to drive anything but an ATV over that trail. And even then, it's going to be super sketch.
Okay.
One of the first things we wanted to get in there was a Starlink. So we got that in there, and that gave them internet access, right? But even with that, they're still information starved, because now you've got the Starlink at one location. Everyone's not living at that one location.
Right.
And it creates its own little micro issues, but they can communicate in and out. And through Wi-Fi calling on phones, now we've just enabled a little bit of calling feature.
Right.
And now we're double and tripling up our backup communications, right? Starlinks they played a big role in this event as well, and good on that company for donating as much as they did, because they didn't just donate airtime, but they donated physical product by the truckload into these areas, and it restored life-saving communications in some aspects. But now it became its own crutch, right? So that's what I have in the back of my head. So we're getting these Starlinks into the area, and a network is a network. It has finite resources, and now we're just adding nodes to this network, and all you're doing is adding load, right? So it's going to slow it down, and what I didn't want to do is create dependency on something that could also go down. I don't know what's going to happen, within this disaster area. So if the Starlink network is somehow negatively affected, I don't want that to be my only communications in and out.
Right.
So, yep, we got Starlink up, but we're going to keep up our VHF, our 2-meter communications, and we're going to try and get Gordon up on an HF capability too, because he did have an older HF radio.
Okay.
Ended up not really working out, especially for digital modes. It was an older radio, but we were good as far as that.
Digital modes aren't something you can just jump into and automatically know how to work.
No.
You can teach somebody to push the button to talk in just a couple of minutes. But getting the software, if you don't already have that downloaded, and then figuring out how to get that to interface with the radio, that takes a bit more pre-training.
It does. It takes a level of effort. And these are perishable skill sets too. So just because I learned it a year ago doesn't mean I'm going to be able to execute on those skills tomorrow.
Right.
And you run 73 Linux and before that Build-A-Pi, right? So you understand very intimately the link between your knowledge, the software, and the hardware, and it all has to come together. And you're not going to just do that overnight. You can't take the knowledge and throw it into the rucksack with the radio.
Well, and even, I work with this stuff day in and day out, every single day. Recently, I pulled out a rig that I haven't used in 2 years. I missed a setting trying to set it up.
Right.
So, and I do this every day. Now, it didn't take very long to figure it out, but that's a setting that I would have missed. Or that I did miss,
right?
Just because I haven't used that particular radio. So even changing one piece of equipment out of that changes the equation a lot of times.
Absolutely. Perishable skill sets. I hammer it all the time. Just because you learned it a year ago doesn't mean you can use it tomorrow. Terry's definitely been putting in the reps and sets into his capability. So when he stepped in to as basically net control, he wasn't looking to assume the role of net control for that repeater, but that's absolutely what happened. And he took it and he did great. He ran with it, and he knew what he needed to do. He got Gordon on a backup simplex frequency because even though they were up on the 2-meter repeater, if something happened, I think there was just enough juice they could get out of that 5-watt Baofeng to get to Terry outside. I didn't like that at all. So along with the Starlink, the first thing that Grindstone got in there was another mobile radio, right?
Oh, that's cool.
So we want to get him from, I think it's 25 watts, just a mobile rig, Yaesu mobile rig. No, it was a BTEC that was donated by Evan at Radio Made Easy. So shout out to Evan at Radio Made Easy, because Evan not only donated the radio, but donated the coax and an antenna for him, and programmed it for the repeater before couriering it down to us. And so all we had to do was, once we took receipt, was test it on the repeater and then throw it into a rucksack and walk it in.
Yeah, plug it up and it's ready to go.
That's it. So now we're off of the 5-watt limitation. Now we're up on 25 watts, and that's going to have the punch to get out of that cove to where Terry is should something happen with the repeater. And wouldn't you know it, something happened to the repeater.
Oh.
So issue number one is the repeater ran out of fuel because it's operating on, there's no power, right? It's just operating off of
Generator backup.
Yep. So in this case, it was propane.
Okay.
Ran out of propane. Shut down the repeater. Right. Excellent example of if something can go wrong, it will go wrong.
Right.
And every day of this deployment was exactly like that. It was something else every day. So
Just
that day,
solving new challenges every day.
every single day. And it's just understanding that we can't get overwhelmed with it. Like today's new left-right limitations are going to look like this. It is what it is. We're going to tackle today, and we're going to figure out whatever the challenges are for tomorrow. So that day, it ran out of fuel. It wasn't down for very long, but it took the one of the trustees to go and hike up a hill, a mountain with propane to get that thing back online.
Wow.
So not nothing, right? It took definitely a level of effort, and I would argue like a level of love for emergency communications and communications in general. To get
I'm
that
sure the
capability
trustee
back up.
had been monitoring this entire conversation
Yes.
as much as possible.
Yes, it actually became an issue where we talked about tactical call signs, and I hope this is the part of the video where you flash this slide up on the screen so everybody can see, like, tactical call signs are a thing.
Yeah. So let's get into this. You guys were using tactical calls, and that upset the repeater owner?
That's what it sounds like, along with other ham radio operators that were on the repeater. So understanding that everybody on that repeater is now disrupted from their daily lives. So even if they're largely unaffected damage-wise, they're now affected because the repeater that they're used to talking on and having their net on every day is no longer happening. And instead, it's these outsiders on your repeater talking back and forth with what largely sounds like military lingo, right? So, you know, if I'm on the radio, you're going to hear me say Roger and out 100,000 times because I'm used to doing that.
Right.
But more importantly, like their nightly rag chew is disrupted. There's an emergency going on. From my perspective, like I don't care about your nightly net. Call me cold-hearted, but we've got actual emergencies to get after. And even if there's no traffic being passed, I don't want an emergency in Little Germany to get thrust below the noise level of what sandwich you ate the night before, right? Keep the net clear even if it's no traffic. Well,
Right.
With our Amron operators coming in, now we establish a radio watch. It's a normal talk thing, right? I want 24-hour coverage of the radios. So now we've got a radio watch, and now we've got multiple call signs. I cannot remember all these call signs. Neither can everybody else. There's no expectation that the SAW crews are going to go out and they're going to remember everybody's call signs too, right?
Right.
So I need something fast and dirty and it's going to work. FOB Cherry Grove, done. All right, that's our new call sign. I'm not asking for permission. I'm not calling the FCC. That is what it's going to be because I'm using it right now.
Well, so, and you were a little confused on this when we first talked about this. Tactical call signs are a common thing. We use them in bike races. We use them in parades. A very simple example of a tactical call is when somebody is operating a net. Whoever your net control is, you don't usually call them by their call sign. You call for net control.
Right.
That's just a small example of a tactical call. So they're very common in amateur radio. These guys may not have been familiar with that, but they're very common in our part of the world anyway. So we're very familiar with it. The only catch to a tactical call is you still have to identify at least every 10 minutes while you're talking with your FCC amateur call sign.
Right.
So as long as you're doing that, you guys are perfectly legal using a tactical call, to my understanding anyway.
Yeah, and that's when you share that slide with me, we started really digging into it, and That's exactly what we did. So we would throw out the tactical call, FOB Cherry Grove, and then follow it up with, this is my call sign, my FCC call sign.
Right.
So all of that should have been put to bed very early, but it wasn't. And then there was miscommunication between the trustee coming on the net after we would pass traffic and basically telling us that this repeater's for amateur use and emergency traffic, which becomes a little ambiguous in what you mean with that. We're in an emergency situation, and it may not seem like my SAW team coming back to the fob, notifying us that all the vehicles, the head count is accounted for, like we're not missing anybody. It may seem like trivial information, but it's absolutely life-saving information.
Now, just so we're clear on this, everybody talking on this was a licensed amateur, right?
So we did have some issues with this too.
Okay.
Right? So we programmed the repeater as a secondary frequency in everybody's radios. And it was the understanding was, if you are not a licensed radio operator, then this is for emergency use. It's life and limb, or somebody else's life and limb.
Okay.
We didn't even get into the property aspect of it. If you're dying and you need to call somebody, you can use this radio.
Right.
All right. And the primary was an FRS frequency.
Okay.
So FRS, get it to our AMRON operator, and the AMRON operator can now take over that external communication. But we did have a couple of guys who just simply pressed the wrong push-to-talk, the wrong button. So like the Baofeng has 2 push-to-talks on it.
Right.
They pushed the wrong one. You do that enough times and it gets people angry. Now, I will fall back to, they're still communicating, right? The last thing we want to do is to bully the disaster relief volunteers into not communicating. Because as soon as you do that, excuse me, as soon as you do that, then something important is going to happen and they're not going to communicate it back. So communicate early, communicate often. I don't care, some of it can seem like too much information. Like the trustee came out with his verbiage about, hey, this is for amateur and emergency use. If you don't check in or get permission from the trustee, then we're going to shut down the repeater, right? That's a non-starter, right? It's emergency operations. Whether you think we're still in an emergency or not really doesn't matter to me, because I can see that we're in the emergency still. And we still have people going out into very dangerous environments that need to communicate. We cleaned up the whole push the right button issue early on, but I think we had already established a little bit of contention and some friction with everybody. And then it just kind of snowballed thereafter. And that's when the jamming started. So we have at least all recorded. We've got somebody who decided they had enough of hearing us on the radio and just lead in on that key.
Jamming the repeater.
Jamming the repeater.
Wow.
Right.
I'm coming home. Goodness. Copy. Done.
And so that's an aspect to this that really nobody knows about. We've heard stories at this point that, yeah, there's some sad hams out there that were upset that we're using the repeater too much, or they feel like we were dominating that resource from them. Obviously, that's not our intention, but we still have to do stuff for, we're thinking about risk to mission, risk to force, right? So that is a life-saving tool the way I look at it. It's not Twitter, you know what I mean? So differences of opinion, right? Well, it got to a point where somebody had enough and was then actually preventing us from communicating on the repeater. So now we've got active jamming going on, and we have the trustees who are mad at us because we're throwing out non-standard calls, basically, or the calls that we were making were things that may not have met the litmus test for importance for that individual, right? So like SAW team, inbound, 5 vehicles, head count of 10, we have everybody's safe, we're out of a dangerous area and scenario.
Right.
That stuff is me as an operations officer, I need to know. I need to know when you're coming, I need to know where you're going, I need to know you got a good head count,
Right.
Kind of basic military stuff. Do we have everybody? And it got to that, the friction got to a point where we had to take necessary action, right? So if the repeater's no longer useful to us, we need to cut over, not just now, but right now.
Yeah, that's what I was about to ask. How did you guys overcome this issue of the bad actor on the repeater?
Right, so we communicate with our AMRON operators in the field, let them know what's going on. We had some back channel communications too, like we're up on HF, and then we had at least one crew who had a Starlink, so we could get some cellular messages on the backside, let them know like this is the issue that we're coming up on. This is what we need to tackle, and we're going to shift over to the Mount Mitchell repeater, which is already overcrowded, and the GMRS repeater, and then we're going to tackle the next issue that arises, and so that's what we did. So at that point, we try to stay off the K4 LNS repeater. We still listen to it. They opened it up for, I thought pretty quickly, they opened it up for general use again, like normal operations. Like it was not time to do that, but it's their repeater to make that call.
Right.
I'll respect that. But then that's when like the rag chew started, and you get some random drunk dude who tells stories about burning tires into the wee hours of the morning. Just the weirdest stuff, man. But again, all right, so back to communications. Like we had an issue. We had thinking on our feet. We provided a resolution. We resolved the issue, and that way, the next day when we're rolling out, we know we're going to go out on this GMRS repeater, and we're going to be relatively okay. Again, geography and topography reign supreme in this situation. Because
Yeah, GMRS can be a little challenging as well.
Yeah,
and there's not near as many GMRS repeaters out there, so
right.
It's kind of thankful that you guys had one that you could utilize.
For sure.
At least in part of your area that you were operating.
Right, and there was we had a gentleman drop off a laundry list of repeaters for us relatively early on that we had to fall back on. I'm really glad that he did. Although, we can sit there and do the homework, but it's really nice when somebody just hands it to you. It's like, hey, if you need this, here it is.
So me and you need to talk later off camera, because I do have a script written that will take all of the repeaters in your area and plot them on a map for you.
Awesome.
So
cool.
We'll discuss that a little later.
Yeah. I also just saw an ATAC plugin for all the APRS repeaters too.
Okay.
And so that was another, that common operating picture was another issue for us for this deployment. We talked about APRS, right?
Right.
I really wanted to use APRS to disseminate our intelligence picture. So now, through Google Earth, I'm plotting all the roads that are down, missing asphalt, so I know that's going to be, it's not going to stop mobility, but it's going to hinder it to one side or another, right? So it's either going to be a slowdown or it's going to be an intermittent stoppage of traffic so they can do repair work.
Right.
Because everybody's working at the same time.
Right.
Linemen, the
road crews,
the road crews,
rescue operations,
everybody.
delivery, all of it's going on at one time.
And we're all just trying to make the best of it. We're all in each other's hair, and it's all for a good reason, but not without its little hiccups.
And it does get frustrating.
It does, for sure.
I mean, we're all human beings, and those frustrations do ramp up from time to time.
Right, and there's going to be bubble overs. And,
Yep.
and that's okay. As long as you anticipate that on the front end, that's part of the disaster. There's a disaster response psychological cycle. And as long as you know that this is a thing and where you are at on that cycle and where somebody else might be too, then you can find
Some common ground.
Some common ground and work.
APRS would have been a great tool to be used in that situation, because you could have literally dropped objects on a map
Right.
for every single thing that was going on.
That was my plan driving in, was I'm going to use APRS to disseminate our intel picture.
Yep.
Massive failure. Massive failure.
We'll see if we can get you up to speed on that.
Right. So after getting comms up in the
I might know a
talk-
guy that knows a
Right,
thing or
yeah,
two.
yeah, thankfully. Yeah, so you popped in my head really early in this. So after we got the radio set up in the talk, we had comms set up, and now I need to start working the intel picture. I'm plotting everything in Google Earth, but now I'm manually transcribing it to, yes, I see you. I'm manually transcribing it to objects in Yak.
Right.
And for whatever reason, they're just not replicating. And I only have a finite amount of time to bang my head against this wall before I got to focus on the next crisis.
Yeah. Again, one of those skills you've got to build prior to, not during.
Exactly. Yeah. And so I freely take that hit. I wish I had already been playing with Yak prior to this. We used it during that refuge exercise. Just kind of seeing what the capabilities and the applicability would be during these kinds of situations. And wouldn't you know it, one of these kind of situations happened. And I was ill-prepared, right? So that's me in my rucksack saying, oh yeah, I'm just going to throw APRS in the rucksack and then I'm going to have it and it's all going to work. And that's not how that works at all. Yeah. Fun with Direwolf. I've been banging my head against the wall with Direwolf.
Direwolf can be fun until you get
fickle,
that.
Man.
Yeah. Well, it's not. It's rock solid. Once you get that configuration file figured out and know exactly what to turn on and what to ignore in there. Because when you open up that default Direwolf file, it's about this long.
Right. Right.
I don't know how many, and there's truckloads of comments in it, but that makes it even more difficult sometimes to find exactly what you're looking for. So
right.
Once you figure it out, Direwolf is rock solid. But
the reason I say it's fickle was I had an issue where if I was using the wrong cable, the wrong USB cable to my DigiRig, I guess it was getting voltage down the line and causing the radio to constantly key, and then Direwolf freaks out and shuts down.
Yeah.
And it took me forever to figure out that I was just too close to a noise source for this, and then I need to choke all these connections in between.
Sounds like an RFI issue.
Yeah, for sure. That's exactly what it was. Right.
Well, is there anything we haven't touched on during this that you wanted to talk about this evening?
Yeah, so I wanted to get some very specific notes from Gordon and from Terry to pass along.
Okay.
If you'll give me just a second to find these.
Sure.
And I wanted to make sure that I relayed these in their words. Okay, so from Gordon, day zero emergency procedures. Okay, so he had his Baofeng. He could talk to somebody was listening and talking back. But he had no idea, there was no communication from FEMA, TEMA, the local authorities on what steps they need to take in their emergency, right? Because they're literally an island unto themselves at this point, but their emergency looks slightly different than the people outside. Right, so they're completely cut off, but the damage on the inside was very, very minimal. They're just cut off. But they need to know things like We need to turn off the electrical breakers because the linemen are going to be working. We need to shut off the water. We need, there's a laundry list of emergency action items that they wish they had, either self-derived or given to them by the local authorities on what to do next. That was big.
That almost sounds like something that the utility department should convey to everyone.
And they probably already have it.
In the event of an emergency, here's what we need you to do as a consumer.
Yeah, exactly. What's going to prevent fire, electrical shock, medical emergencies, all those things, while your external resources are trying to build your world back together again. I'm sure that these documents exist, they just didn't get them. And so the highlight here is, if you don't get it, it may as well not exist.
Right.
So I think that falls back to communicating those things, knowing from a net control perspective, like, I need to make sure that I communicate this to them so that they know. Along with that is, from a net control perspective, early and often let those that are not licensed ham radio operators, that have maybe never picked up a radio before, talking to them as the net controller and telling them, if you're in an emergency, call us, push it. Don't be afraid to hit the push to talk. There's going to be some level of apprehension because they've never touched this thing before. They don't want to do the wrong thing. They've heard, maybe horror stories about, transmitting without a license. And so that's gonna cause a delay with them communicating their needs, which could be life and limb. So as a net controller, I think we need to know this is the information that we need to take in and process from people, but this is also, this information, this bucket of information needs to get relayed out during the lulls, because for certain, there's somebody who has an emergency that's not communicating it because of that apprehension.
Right.
A tiered community communications plan. So with the radio situation, I guess the Washington County Sheriffs had dropped off 2-meter radios, multiple 2-meter radios inside the community of Little Germany. Well, Gordon's the only licensed radio operator, so he knows the Voice Pro and he knows how to make contacts, and everybody else is just kind of talking on a walkie-talkie. And it's also creating disparities between who knows what from a relief effort. So if Bob hears that the water's not going to be restored for 6 months, and John hears that the water's being restored right now, that's an obvious disparity that we need to clear up. And when you're on the 2-meter repeater doing that, it's very ugly, because now you're broadcasting that out to the world, this mismatch of information, and it's causing everybody else external to that emergency to try and figure out, well, which one is more right than the other. So tiering that off and saying, okay, in our community or my neighborhood, these two people, I'm going to have a primary and I'm going to have a backup radio operator for our community. So if something happens in our neighborhood, Tom is going to jump on the 2-meter. Everybody else is going to jump on our FRS radios into Tom. And Tom is going to act as net control for our community and then communicate to the outside world what our issues are and our needs, right? Very specifically medical emergency type stuff, because that's the most time critical. I think those communications plans need to be discussed amongst ourselves to figure out how are we going to do that.
Amongst your neighbors.
Right.
Yeah.
Because if everybody jumps on the repeater at the same time, the repeater becomes useless if you don't have a solid set of net controllers.
Right.
And with Dan and Vicky, right? So in the interview that you did with Dan, one of the standout pieces of information was they needed a relief.
Yeah.
And so did Gordon. So did Terry.
Yeah.
And that's where we identified this early, right? Your any sort of radio watch rotation has to have relief.
Right.
So let's key up bodies to be that relief for them, and then we'll just trade them out
Yeah, I
and
think
give them a
Dan
break.
said he called on like 3 or 4 of his friends just to help pass the messages through text
Right.
and phone calls. Because
Exactly.
he was just overloaded with those requests coming in.
Right, and think about all the logging involved too, right? So
Right.
if you're doing a solid job as a net controller, you're logging all these contacts or as much as you can, and that's a nightmare.
If I remember, he said he had 4 legal pads
Right,
full.
full.
So
Right.
that's a lot.
Yeah, and that's where I would say I take that as a personal failure on me, is that we weren't logging all of this traffic. We were acknowledging traffic and we were stepping in to communicate where and when it was needed, but we could have done a better job of logging all this traffic and knowing who's who in the zoo, where are they located geographically, things of that nature. Back to this, aftercare came up. So for Terry, his church family became very pivotal for him because, working, let's just throw a number out there, let's say 15 days. If he's working 15 hours a day for 15 days straight, you're going to become mentally smoked.
Yeah.
And he's emotionally invested. Once we had Amron operators there and standing by, it was very important to us as Grindstone, the organization, very important to me that I did not make Terry feel like we were pulling him away from his mission. He had been there since day 0, and we're not here to take that away from you. There's no way to assume that role without it becoming deeply personal.
Right.
And we didn't want to interfere with that. We're here when you're ready to take a break, because you need to take a break too.
Right.
And we'll be here, but until then, we've got your back. I think communicating that was very important. And then back to the aftercare, him aligning himself with friends, family, and his church community, as specifically highlighted, has been very important for him to be able to just process all of this stress and all these feelings and all the, you get into your own head, right? So as I've stated a couple of times, things that really aren't my personal failures, I take on as personal failures.
Right.
That's the way disaster relief is. That's the way emergencies are. We're going to take them to heart, and you have to have a way to process these things. So if you're a religious person, I highly recommend just having a plan for that and saying, okay, just like if somebody had some other hardship, if somebody gets sick or in a car accident, we got to come together and really support each other. And that's no different here in the amateur radio community. His last note was, loving the people is more important than the ham radio structure. And what he was specifically referencing is, yes, there's going to be people who aren't licensed that are jumping on the repeater. There's going to be people who have dirty voice pro, right? Gordon, when he first got on, his voice pro was poor because he hadn't been putting in those reps and sets, right? And even he laughs about it. And during the event, he would make these remarks like, "Oh man, my voice procedures are just off," and not really putting himself down, but he was making that acknowledgement, like, "Hey, it could have been better." And again, we were there just to tell him, like, you're doing great. You're doing everything ham radio was designed to do. This moment right here, right now.
This is
and
it.
you're at the center of it, man. And just reassuring him, like, hey, it's okay, you're going to get better. And then he acknowledged that too, because every day he was getting more reps and sets because he had to. And he got better and better. And now his voice pro is completely tight. He knows how to talk on a radio. He knows how to operate on a radio.
Right.
But to Terry's point, loving the people behind the radio is far more important than, does he have a license? What's his voice pro like? Is he using the wrong vernacular? Is it this or is it that? None of that stuff matters in an emergency, right?
I mean, we can forget the legalities and just focus on the moral right thing to do.
Exactly.
So.
And that's a key theme that I've had during this deployment is, what's the next right thing to do?
Yeah.
And for Terry, the next right thing to do was to love thy neighbor. And thy neighbor was behind a radio, and that's what he did.
Right.
And I think the success of the Gordon Terry Little Germany story is, I think it's a beautiful story, number one, and I think it's a testament to the importance of amateur radio and what it can really do. Because now these guys are bonded, right? It's
Right.
Call it trauma bonding, but they're bonded now.
Yeah.
They'll
be friends.
They will. They will be in contact probably for the rest of their lives because they've just gone through this together. And I think it's powerful stuff, man. It's not just a story of, hey, I used a ham radio and we saved the day.
Right.
There's a lot deeper meaning to this.
Well, both of them definitely got emotionally invested.
I think we all did, man.
And it's impossible not to.
It really is.
When you spend even 4 or 5 days, much less 15 or 16, going through that, you're going to have some investment.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think it's hard not to become emotionally invested. You have to stop yourself at certain points, right? Because like I was explaining, so Little Germany became this very deep focus for me. And when you're running a talk, that's one mission of many.
Right.
And so having to pull yourself up and out of that for a minute, even though it can look like to them that we've forgotten about them for the day, it's not really true. We're still resourcing them, but we still have to take care of the other people too.
Right.
Right. That's tough. It's tough when it becomes personal. Right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So those are the notes from Terry and Gordon. I will get you their call signs, and then I definitely want to make sure I give you Kelvin's information too. Great, incredible people, incredible story.
Man, I greatly appreciate you taking the time. Those are things that probably most people will never hear about. And it's kind of cool to get the information out there and the story out there about Little Germany.
From Cherry Grove, this is Cherry Grove. Be advised, the SAW teams in Poplar, North Carolina are returning to work. Copy, the teams are going back to work. Thank you for that update. Be safe. This is Kilowatt 4 Lima November Sugar, trustee of the 147.27 repeater. This repeater is for amateur use only and for emergency situations. There'll be no more traffic on this repeater unless authorized by the trustee, K4LNS. Otherwise, the repeater will be shut down and no further use will be allowed. K4LNS.